I wasn't really surprised to find myself at the house in Emerald Street that following Saturday. I debated about it all week, but in the end, all other factors notwithstanding, I was curious. Micah was brilliant, top 1% of his class, several published papers. What if he was right? What if he did see something? People have near-death experiences every day and came back with stories. Micah was going deeper into death than anyone who had ever come back from before, and he was doing it in a controlled environment, using an experiment that could be easily duplicated. I mean, who knows? Micah greeted me at the door with a smile that said he knew I'd come, and walked me to the large, barren living room. It sported tan walls, hardwood floors, lots of hospital equipment, and 3 cheap-looking twin beds. Sean and Holly were already laying on 2 of the beds with nervous smiles on their faces and IVs in their arms. Irina was bustling around, checking equipment and looking incredibly stressed. Micah handed me an expensive-looking heavy camera. The cameras at the end of our beds are already recording. There are static cameras. I need you to walk around and record with this one as well. Irina is going to stagger our injections so that she can handle all 3 of us. You are simply a witness, nothing more. Okay. Micah, are you sure you want to do this? Bridget, we've been testing this, and as long as Romeo is injected in under a minute, which it will be, there is no risk. There's definitely a risk, Micah, in near-death experiences. This isn't a near-death experience. It's a death experiment. Look, I know you're worried, and that's why I wanted you here, to make sure nothing goes wrong. And even if it does, I have stacks and stacks of notes and narratives proving that this was my experiment. Yeah, but... I couldn't think of anything else to say. Any objection I had, Micah would have an answer for. That's just the way he was. There was no stopping him now. I could either be here to see it or be somewhere else to hear about it. I chose to stay. Micah walked over to stand in front of my camera. It's 12:51 p.m. on Saturday, January 14th. I am Micah York, and this is the first attempt of the Afterlife Experiment. Micah walked over to his bed and sat down, letting Irina expertly thread a needle into his vein. He lay back on the pillow and turned to Sean and Holly. Remember, guys, as soon as you regain consciousness, speak directly to your cameras about what you saw. Yep, got it. Okay, guys, Irina said with a shaky voice. Everything is ready. All right, Micah said excitedly. 30 seconds, that's all. Irina, as soon as the last of the Juliet leaves the tube, hit this timer. Micah pointed to the digital clocks that were set to 30 seconds at the head of each bed. Irina nodded. See you on the other side. Micah smiled and gave a thumbs up to Holly and Sean, who returned it and then settled back on their beds. I hit record. Irina picked up 3 red tubes of thick, clear liquid from a nearby table. Steadying her hands, she slowly injected the first tube into Micah's IV, and then hit the timer above him. At the exact moment she did, Micah's heart rate monitor flatlined. I jumped at the high-pitched squeal and tried to steady the camera. Irina hurriedly moved over to Sean and did the same for him, and then Holly. Now all 3 EKG machines were loudly flatlining. Irina put her hands over her ears for a minute, then pointed to a different monitor. Get this, Bridget. Record this. It was Micah's EEG, and there were 0 active brainwaves. Get Holly and Sean's too. I could suddenly taste a bitter metal in my mouth, and I knew I was beginning to panic. This had been a bad idea. A very bad idea. By the time I looked back over to Micah's timer, there was 8 seconds left on it. Irina had already loaded up a green tube, the Romeo biologic, to Micah's IV and was just waiting to push it in. The chorus of all 3 EKG machines wildly sounding their alarms was deafening. It was screaming at us. Do something. Do something. Why are you just standing there? Save them. Just when I thought I couldn't stand it anymore, a different alarm buzzed, and Irina injected the Romeo into Micah's arm. I didn't breathe at all as I waited for Micah's vital monitors to show life. It took less than 5 seconds for the EKG machine to register a spike, and then another. Micah's EEG machine suddenly flared to life as well. I exhaled. Irina had just stepped over to Sean when Micah suddenly shot up in bed, eyes wide, and opened his mouth. I was so excited and furious that I almost forgot to hold the camera up. I couldn't wait to hear what he had to say. But Micah didn't say anything. He just screamed. The surprise and force of it made me stumble back into a wall. It was the most blood-curdling scream I had ever heard. And then Sean started screaming too. Micah took no notice of him and threw himself off the bed to the floor, slamming his head on the wood over and over again. Sean had also jumped out of bed and run over to the wall to stand just 2 inches from it, screaming at it as if he didn't know the wall was there. My shock quickly gave way to panic. Micah's head was already bloody, and the sound it made against the hard oak was sickening.
Irina, help me!
Irina, who hadn't moved since Sean had knocked her out of the way, stared at me wide-eyed.
We need to get him off the floor. He's hurting himself.
She opened her palm and looked down at the last tube of Romeo Biologic, as if she'd never seen it before.
You didn't give that to her yet? Give that to Holly, now!
My voice was high and wild. I was holding Micah in my arms while he continued to hit his head against the air, as if the floor were still there. And the screaming. Oh God, the screaming. Both Micah and Sean were splitting my ears open, the horror on Micah's face as he beat his head harmlessly against the air, mouth open in a wide O, and the sharp, agonizing terror coming out of Sean was enough to make my eyes well up in fear. What had happened? What had they seen? The camera, long forgotten, lay discarded under Micah's bed where his flailing legs had kicked. Irina was doing frantic chest compressions on Holly, tears streaming from her eyes. But I knew it was too late. Holly was lost.
Irina! Irina! Call 911!
She didn't stop working on Holly, just continued on like she hadn't heard me. And perhaps she hadn't. The screaming. I let go of Micah just for a moment to grab my phone, and he was up and running. He hit the front door and smashed his forehead against the glass.
Micah, stop!
If Sean noticed us near him, he didn't show it. He just continued that piercing, horrible scream. Emergency services couldn't hear me on the phone, but they had someone at the house within 5 minutes. A very, very long 5 minutes. Irina gave up on Holly at some point and just paced around the room mumbling, I don't understand. I did it right. I don't understand. They took Sean, Holly, and Micah away in an ambulance, and they took me and Irina to the police station. They watched the videos. I never graduated, but at least I didn't go to prison like Irina. I retreated into myself after her trial and refused to speak to anybody. I spent months holed up in my apartment, asking the same questions over and over. What did they see? And it's not like I could ask them. Sean had screamed until he permanently lost the use of his voice. Now he sits in a room in a hospital, facing a wall with his mouth wide open, as if he were screaming. And somehow, that's worse than the screaming. He hasn't said or written a word since that day. Micah, he's in a hospital too. Sometimes he screams and sometimes he's quiet. Sometimes he thrashes and sometimes he lies as still as the dead. I have visited them both many times, begging them to tell me what they saw. But my visits were fruitless until this last time. Yesterday, when I visited Micah, he was in his screaming stage. I sat with him and let him scream, waiting to see if he would transition to one of his catatonic stages so that I could speak. When I was tired of waiting, I leaned in close to his ear and I asked him, "Micah, what did you see?" His screaming slowly morphed into an insane, uncontrollable laughter I'd never heard before. His doctor, who'd been just outside, came running into the room.
"What did you do?"
he asked, alarmed.
"I just asked him a question,"
I responded quietly.
"What was the question?" "I asked him what he saw."
We both noticed the sudden silence at the same time. We slowly turned toward Micah to find him facing us, no expression on his face. "It's all waiting for you. It's waiting for all of us." Then his mouth fell open into a large O, and the laughter slowly began again, followed by shrill, horrible screams. I left the hospital that day, wishing I had never come at all, wishing I'd never met Micah. I drove home with tears pouring down my cheeks. What did they see? What's on the other side? Do I even want to know? But it really doesn't matter anymore. Someday I'll find out. And so will you.